Welcome to another episode of the How to Save the World podcast, where we take a deep dive into the academic research and behavioural science of what really gets people to take pro-environmental action and behaviour. I'm your host, Katie Patrick. I'm an environmental engineer and a designer based in Silicon Valley, California, and I'm the author of the book, How to Save the World. Hi there, green friends. Welcome to the second episode in this series about the exact nitty-gritty steps it takes to transform the roads and streets and urban spaces around us. Today's guest is Kieran Farr. Kieren is a technologist and the founder of a really neat software platform called 3D Street. 3D Street was born of Kieren's passion for urban design and for safe streets and safe biking, especially considering that he is the father of two small children. It's a really neat platform that kind of gamifies a little bit like Roblox or Minecraft and makes it easy to simulate or to design different types of streetscapes for your community advocacy or for your urban planning process. Personally, I have never been involved in the transformation process or the political or the urban planning systems of how you actually get a street to become what looks like the ecotopia of our dreams. So I was really keen to talk to people that were experts in this process and documented the absolute nitty-gritty ABCs, A to Z, of exactly what you need to do, almost like a recipe or a manual for people that want to get rid of parking spaces and make safer streets with more trees and more bicycles and less cars and all that stuff that we need. In this conversation, I was really thrilled. Kieren does a masterful job of laying out the exact 15 steps that he took to get a bike lane added to 17th Street in San Francisco. He's extremely knowledgeable and articulate about how to make these processes work. And I've also documented these steps in the conversation in my email tutorial series that is available when you sign up to helloworlde.com/action tips. I put a lot of effort into re-listening to the episode, writing out each step succinctly and carefully, adding images and making it really clear. So it is really a fantastic guide what to go through if you want to take it upon yourself to try to change a street near you. Now, don't think that streets are unchangeable. Streets are changed all of the time. But it just takes people knowing how the system works, knowing how to advocate with their local city government and making it happen. And again, do not miss the written tutorial. It is available at Hello World with an E on the end, helloworlde.com/action tips. The link is in the podcast description below. Before we dive in, I wanted to let you know that the School of Climate Action Design is now open for enrollment, and I would love to invite you to apply. It's an online community and 6-week co-design lab where we help environmental leaders like you build campaigns that successfully trigger behaviours that scale into real movements of change. You can apply at helloworlde.com. The link is in the show notes. And I tell you what, I'm 45 now, and if I could give my 25-year-old environmental engineer self one piece of advice, it would be to learn behavior design. Once I finally understood what drives human behavior and how to design it, my whole world changed. It unlocked this new ability, and I started having the best ideas I'd ever had and continue to that don't just get stuck in the usual 2 or 5% engagement rates, but somehow burst into people's motivation and get these dramatic results like 40 or even 70% shift in engagement. And this is not special to me. It is a system, a formula, a recipe, and you can learn it too. You just need to know how to put the ingredients together. If your green program is stuck and not getting the traction that you want, it's not because your community doesn't care or lacks knowledge or you don't have enough funding. It might seem like this on the surface, but these are rarely the real bottleneck. It's because you don't have an action system, and you're probably making at least one of these common mistakes. Number 1, you're doing all education with no defined action trigger. Number 2, you don't have an engagement funnel with specific moments of conversion. Or 3, people are dropping off because there's too much cognitive load or poor choice architecture. If you confuse, you lose, and it's incredibly easy to do, especially when we are talking about complex topics like the Earth. The action system you need is an evidence-based method that attracts the right people, builds motivation, and triggers a behavior, all along a central axis of your core feedback loop that I call the God metric. Inside the School of Climate Action Design, I teach the exact models I use working with groups like UNEP, Stanford and Harvard University, Google, NASA, and many small NGOs and clean tech startups around the world. We cover fundamentals like the action triad, that is the smallest core building block of change you need to get right. We map a detailed blueprint of your target person's pathways to action called behavior mapping that includes 96 different behavioral triggers. And you'll create a 6-step engagement funnel, a sequence of stepping stones that guides people to complete the action, as well as gamification, the 12-step storytelling formula, visual design essentials, and more. And it includes my new and favorite program, Earth Doctors, 12 weeks of gamified sustainability STEAM activities for kids and classrooms. If you are ready to shift from fuzzy, stab-in-the-dark sustainability to becoming a crystal clear designer of change, supported by a community of PhD environmental psychologists and world-class design mentors, please pause this episode and apply now at helloworlde.com. Don't be the team that spends years or millions on a campaign that ends with, "It didn't work." Invest the 6 weeks, learn the things, and master the art of designing change. Let's have no sustainability campaign left behind. Enrollment is now open by application only, and we only run it once a year, so don't miss out. Apply at helloworlde.com. The link is in the show notes. And I promise you, you really can change the world and you can make it fun. Now let's jump into this wonderful conversation with Kieran Farr. Welcome to the show, Kieren. Thanks so much for being on with us today.
Thanks, Katie. Happy to be here.
Now, where are we going to start with this big conversation? Do you want to just start telling us a little bit about your software, 3D Street, and like what inspired you to start building this software and just about what it does? Because it's a great tool for people to use and they'll be able to use it. And then it'll sort of explain a little bit about like what got you interested in it and how you saw that there was a kind of a technology gap.
Totally. Yeah. So like you mentioned, I've been working on advocacy as a local community member here in San Francisco for many years. And in doing so, I realized, gosh, it's hard. There's lots of different challenges. And one part of that challenge is how do we communicate with other people about changes to our built environment? And it turns out that it's really hard. And a lot of people, in fact, I would say most people, you can't just imagine something different. You really do need visuals or prior examples to think of something that may be outside the box or not your typical street widening project that everyone's familiar with when they see the orange cones on the street. So I think that really is kind of what started this. It's my own advocacy work and seeing the challenge that we had in communicating what can be possible if people hadn't had that experience to see it beforehand.
And what was interesting in our conversations we've had is that you've kind of got two different ways of seeing this way that you can do a visual of a street you want to have changed, like, for example, a bike lane or whatever. You've got the engineering crew, say expert engineers and architects, and they do it a certain way, and they do it, it's very specific. It has to be done to the absolute Latin longs, and it is a specific and exact engineering project. I don't know what they use. Do they use AutoCAD?
Yeah, usually AutoCAD. Civil engineer will map out, very precisely where all the elements are in the roadway. And that's been the same way since people would do that by hand and draw out these things in a plan view, kind of a top-down bird's eye view. And it works in an engineering context where you have that experience and training to be able to pretty quickly translate what you see on a blueprint into reality. But most people don't have that skill set. It's really hard for lay people to interpret a maze of lines on a piece of paper into something that actually exists in the real world.
Yeah, and so if you were working with a group of professional engineers and architects, they'll have that AutoCAD file, and then the architectural software will do a very beautiful rendering that you need a really super powerful computer that might even run. I mean, when I used to work as an engineer, our computers would run for like 2 or 3 days to actually render these. And the softwares are quite expensive, and you get this beautiful, like, photorealistic thing. That's when you're actually designing it. But there's like a whole like other world or sort of platform or style of communication that's needed. If you're like not an engineer or not an architect, you're just a person in the community who needs to visualize what you think this bike path or this tree might look like. That's like a way like inaccessible way of doing it, very time consuming, expensive. Can you talk a bit more about what this other style of visualization is and how it's needed and how it serves a completely different purpose to the actual engineering drawings?
Totally. So, we as humans interact with this sort of stuff, but in a very different way that we often don't consider engineering, which is video games. So, all ages of people play video games, and there's tons of these in the genre of city building, designing, even creation apps that are more loose, like Minecraft or Roblox or applications like this. So it is interesting to me to see that we actually have a lot of prior examples of how to use real-time computer graphics in an accessible manner. In other words, with an interface that kids can understand, that allows people to be super creative. And so it is a little funny to me that we have this amazing capability in prior art, but then when we think about how we design and interact with our streets, it's using techniques that are 100 plus years old, and often, practitioners do not look to video games as inspiration that's seen as something that's just separate in a different world. And so I think a lot of our exploration is like, what if we can bring those things together and make things that are as accessible as a video game, but also are realistic and, they're possible, they're feasible to actually have in the ground.
And so you kind of want to make something that's almost as easy and fun to use as Minecraft to reimagine your street. But the purpose, like, how does that lead into like community advocacy? If I'm just a regular person who wants to change my street, like, where does that all fit in?
Yeah, so one of the most difficult things I found as an advocate is this pattern where you have an idea that often a lot of neighbors support for some sort of street change. It could be as simple as a speed bump. It could be a road diet where you decrease the width of the street a little bit. It could be active mobility or bike lanes or
Sorry, did you say
curbable
road diet?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a word?
Yeah.
I've never heard
It's
that
a
before.
word.
That's so funny.
Yeah, it's like going from, for example, 4 lanes, 2 in each direction, to 1 lane in each direction with a center shared turn lane. That would be an example of a pretty classic road diet, and that gives you more space to put accessible elements or bicycle lanes or wider sidewalks, etc.
Right. And so you were saying about the community advocacy, like people support it. And what was your biggest frustration with trying to get people's support?
So they have all these cool ideas, and then they go to present it to other community members, and the number one cause for concern is loss of parking. And it's kind of getting back to the very human reaction, which is loss aversion, the feeling like you're losing something. And often the advocates for these new projects do a good job of explaining the benefits in a very verbal or their best attempt to describe why this is a good project. But it's really difficult to visualize what that could be. And so therefore, people that are perhaps opponents of the project or not on board yet, they're not going to take the time to think through why this would be a good thing. They're just going to say, I'm losing something. And so whether we like it or not, part of the role of an advocate is to help people who are on the fence or not sure. And one of the most powerful tools for that are visual tools and narrative storytelling about how our world can be a better place. And that's hard. Like, it takes time and effort. And now there are more tools out there, and that's part of what we're providing, that make it a little bit easier for advocates to be able to tell that story and leading with positivity and what could be to help divert some of the negative feedback that often we find comes from suggestions for anything new, because it's scary.
Right. So when you think about it that way in terms of like achieving change, it's a sequence of events or it's a system. Mm-hmm. And there are things that can go wrong, that can make it fail.
Mm-hmm.
And people's opposition is like one of the key points at when it will fail. Like it might fail just because you run out of energy or because the council says no. But one of these main points of failure is going to be because everybody says, no, we don't want it. We don't want it.
That's right.
We want to keep it the way it is. And so when you're going into a project like this, you need to be prepared to communicate with everybody in a way that's going to dilute or appease or hopefully like smooth out this kind of opposition. It sounds like it's a very serious thing that you need to plan for. in your community advocacy plan. And the more visual images, or the easier it is for people to make these visual images, is going to be like a critical point at showing it, at presenting it, and also showing it as a value add rather than a loss. We went into this with Tim a lot as well, that the loss aversion and framing, it's like a common thing in psychology. If people think they're losing something, they get very upset about losing something, far more upset than the positivity that they would experience by gaining something new.
That's
so
right.
you have to be very careful about not making it look like they're losing anything.
That's right. Yep. And then it's compounded by the fact that often for these projects, the people who benefit will not know about it ahead of time. They may not even live there yet. And so you have people who live there who are loss averse. Then you have the future folks that will benefit that can't represent themselves. And so you see this bias a lot in any form of civic activism where just change is really hard. And so the more tools we have that can help visualize how the change will be good really helps a lot for change makers to share their vision and move those projects forward.
And do you have any like little sort of case studies or anecdotes where you've experienced that in real life? Like you've talked to people and they've been like, no way. And then you've tried it with the visuals and they've been like, wow. And you've just like really felt it like in your own one-on-one human conversations?
Totally. Yeah, there's tons of examples of this. And I think part of what helps is when you have the ability to kind of change things in real time. So you were mentioning before, and in the old days, we would have to render things out or have an engineer design something. And what I find that really helps opponents become at least neutral, if not proponents, is to be involved in that process where we come up with alternatives in real time. So I'll give a very concrete example, which is on this 17th Street bike lane. There are multiple businesses that use the roadway for loading, unloading for their businesses. And engaging with them to talk about what the realistic alternatives are goes a very long way to helping them support the project. And so that's exactly what we did. So we helped proactively with those businesses to think through, what could a loading zone look like that also accommodates a bike lane, and then makes it easier for them to be supporters of the project because it actually gives them more loading space or reserved loading space that before they had to jockey for in competition with other people parking. So that's, whether we like it or not, parking loss is really the major part of a lot of these projects. Other examples include a pedestrian project that one of our users is working on Hayes Valley, on Hayes Street. So he's proposing, let's actually make this maybe a road diet from multiple lanes into one lane. And a big part of that is actually going to all the residents and local businesses and showing them, here's ways that you can increase the number of tables that you have so you make more money. Or here's ways that you can have a specific loading zone that's right in front of your business if that's important to you. Or here's the way that the condo can maintain access to their garage while also accommodating other forms of transit. So those tools help, especially when they're in real time and you can actually have that discussion and move things around. Then it opens up possibilities that the world can change, and then we can have this discussion and that you can work together to find a solution that meets everyone's needs.
When you mean real time, do you mean that like you're there with an iPad with your software that's like a little bit like, I don't know if I'm going too far calling it like Minecraft for streets, but you're not saying
it's a good analogy.
Okay, you're not saying, oh, this is what we want to do. You're just starting with an open question. And when you mean real time, you mean like, let's move some blocks around and like work this out together.
Totally. And we didn't invent this. We were inspired by other apps for this sort of advocacy use case, like StreetMix. So StreetMix is a different app than 3D Street, but we really like the way they approached this almost a decade ago when they first started, to be able to make it simple to change these things immediately. And it's exactly what you're describing. It's the ability to have a conversation, and that these tools are prototyping tools. And I think that's important because we're not intending that we know the answer. Instead, what we're saying is, here is one of the answers, but you now, dear citizen, have the ability to participate in this conversation and not just be fed the designs, but to be an equal in modifying that. So, we've taken that basic concept of the ability to change things immediately and brought that to the third dimension so that we can have those conversations. And whether we like it or not, it is about access and parking in most cases all over the world for these sorts of projects.
And I mean, you must get a better result in the end by doing it that way in terms of like the actual practical engineering outcome by
Totally.
having someone who has to like literally like load a whole bunch of like bottles from a truck into a restaurant every day. Like what they're going to tell you is like a far better solution than I think someone who's just like a white collar traffic engineer, civil engineer who like has never had to do that job.
Correct. And the traffic engineers will say, we appreciate the ability to engage with the constituents in a way that's constructive and productive, because prior to these tools existing for real-time collaboration, what often would happen is that the city would do its best to engage, but there's a very real limit to their capacity to make all these modifications on a bespoke basis. So the hope, the nirvana we have here is that the community becomes an actual participant in that design so that it is better than what an engineer can come up with in a vacuum on their own, and that we have the ability to crowdsource or, have the best ideas come forward. And it's hard to do. Like, it's not perfect, but it already is achieving a lot of benefits that we see in all sorts of projects that our users are doing. And the first reaction is just, wow, I didn't know that was possible, or I hadn't thought about that. And even just that reaction from an opponent of a project, that they're thinking about it, like that's what you want, because you're not going to convert them immediately, but you're helping them think through there are other options, even if I don't like this initial proposal. So instead of saying no, I'm going to engage and think about what would be a way to adapt it or collaborate on a compromise.
And it really makes me think about the important qualitative element of change. I think like most of us who are in like sustainability are pretty much mostly scientists and engineers make up the bulk of like the profession, right? And, we get taught a very mechanistic way of thinking. Did you study like engineering or computer science? Is that your
I did a
training?
minor in that sort of stuff, but yeah, I would agree. And I work with a lot of folks in that industry, and a lot of the focus traditionally of a traffic engineer was about queuing theory and traffic flow and level of service as defined by the number of vehicles that could move through an intersection. So I think that's been endemic in the traffic engineering industry. And to the credit of the industry and the professionals, there's a realization that that's not great. And I think what we're observing now across the world, so both in the US and also in other countries, is they're realizing that this may not be the best way, but I think there's a lot of confusion about what is better. Like, how do we systemically provide this sort of community-led design? And the tools are part of it, but there's also political processes that need to change as well to accommodate that. It's not just a technology solution.
Yeah, and this is kind of like why I get, even though like my training is in sort of engineering or green building design, why I've become such an enthusiast of environmental psychology or this kind of social science of change. Because we've kind of got this world where all of us are just like, see the world so mechanistically. We're like, here's a building or here's a road, and we can calculate all the CO2 emissions and the amount of vehicles going past and what the air pollution is. And you know it all. And we know that to fix it, it needs to be this. And then somehow in that process, it gets really stuck and it gets really stymied. And all the engineers just have the complete mechanistic answer. We'll be like, but we have a climate report. We have data. We have science. And therefore, because we have data and science, therefore, everybody should just do it differently. But in this like process of sort of getting from this like A to B, there are all of these like subtle nuances. And so I think even if like the guy with the truck who's unloading the bottles, perhaps he doesn't perhaps come up with like the best idea, like the actual kind of design input he has is not perhaps relevant, but the fact that you're having a conversation and you're listening and he's engaging. I'm assuming it's a he. Obviously, women don't like pull bottles out of trucks. Sorry about the gender, everybody. It's so uncool in San Francisco to use gender. Maybe they're they when they load the bottles. That having this this listening, this empathy, this collaborative engagement, it is that psychological space that has to be experienced by a person in order for the mechanistic change to happen. And it's just this whole kind of thing I've sort of saying over and over again with my work is to become, we're so used to communicating with just like facts and figures, thinking that facts and information will do the work. Or you've got money. You've got these two levers. You can tell people facts or you can pay them. But there is this like whole psychological fabric that has so much nuance to it. It just sounds like that's really what, even though you're making software, what you're really doing is manipulating and influencing the psychological fabric of the process.
Yeah, and I would add to that what I think had been missing before in a lot of these conversations is a visual language. So in other words, as a constituent, I see a plan and I just don't understand it. And so I disengage. And what I observe that can be very helpful with software like StreetMix or 3D Street is that, yes, they can help you design things, but they also give you the visual building blocks akin to Lego so that you can have that substantive conversation. And sometimes it's literally what we're talking about is as simple as a layperson, I don't know the words for these things. I don't know to call it diagonal, perpendicular, parallel parking. Like a lot of people just don't have those terms.
Is that a real term or did you make it up?
Yeah, well, I'm mixing them together. You know?
I don't.
But you get into this buzzword thing, and just the words that you use can be complicated. And so having tools that let you visually see, oh, I like this thing, but not this thing, and it makes communication possible where that bridge was too far without those visual communication tools for an untrained person to be able to communicate effectively with a professional engineer. So I think that language part is really important, and language might not even be the right word. It's just kind of like, how do we think about spatial relationships of things and communicate that with other people in a simple way? And that's hard.
Yeah, and I think like in addition to just, let's say if somebody's not doing the real time using it, they're just only viewing, like that's important. But in one of my favorite podcast episodes I've done, I found the research paper on it. One of the social scientist researchers got people to actually draw a picture of the sort of sustainable future. But he was testing the two different groups. There's the control and there's two different groups. One group just passively saw a picture and a paragraph about a sustainable future. Like in the future, everything will be clean energy powered, the environment will be saved or whatever. And the other group had to actively draw a picture of it and write their own one. Now, the one that had the active group was like way ahead of the one that was passive. And I just found that so fascinating. I've never seen any other research from it. And what they were testing the result was they tested them on their pro-environmental behavior 30 days later, and they tested them on whether they would voluntarily handwrite a letter to their local environmental minister. So after the study had finished, they said, you don't have to, but if you wanted to, would you like to write a letter? And the ones who had been the active engagement had a much higher both behavior and writing the letter. And that just kind of blew my mind. Also, it was kind of a funny little ad, like Build-A-Bear. I've never seen a Build-A-Bear.
Yeah.
Build-A-Bear is this crazy success story of the kids building these things and the IKEA effect where people get more emotionally connected to things after they've built it.
Totally. I got to make it myself with this little wrench. So that's going to be my favorite bookshelf ever.
Yeah. I just think anyone, if they can be in just the act of just engaging in any way with that kind of design process themselves is going to just create a fundamental psychological shift to all of their behaviors and attitudes in a way that I think is the environmental movement needs to understand this. I feel like this is a huge thing that we're not doing enough.
I agree. And I think what's critical of that is to involve people that may not always be in favor of your project or aligned with you when that process starts. And so I can share an example of this in this neighborhood in the Mission District of San Francisco. There's been a project to change parking regulation, and it's complicated. As a business, you have certain goals for parking. You might want to have lots of parking for your customers. You may want to have parking that's reserved for your employees. You might have parking for loading and unloading. What I observed was that when this working group started, all the business owners were against meters. They were against paid regulation of parking. They wanted to park anywhere they wanted. As they engaged with this process and they themselves went to go talk to other business owners, community members, they convinced themselves that we do need regulation of parking so that there's turnover, So these are called parking meters. The technology exists, but it wasn't any data that I or other members of the committee or staff could provide to them that would convince them of that. It was them exploring the community on their own to come to those conclusions. And now the group that had come up with this is advocating to others in the neighborhood to implement this plan. And before we went through this process of jointly coming up with that plan would be, they were not in favor of any sort of regulation of parking. So that's one experience where I've seen that happen in real time. And effectively, it's difficult because as a city staff member, you're empowering a group of community members to explore on their own. And you're not just telling them what to do. And it can take longer. It can be a messy process. But what I am observing is that often people are smart. And when they have the time and ability to engage and are given that trust, you can be surprised by what they come back with and how aligned environmentalists can be with a business owner who wants to make sure that their business is accessible by all modes of transit because it's better for business.
Yeah, and I kind of think that there is an objective best solution for all. Like, maybe not everyone believes that, but I kind of think in most situations, things will go sort of backwards and forwards and people try different things. But I think if you keep iterating the problem over and over again, you eventually get to like a stable, ultimate best place. And I think that kind of ultimate solution will eventually come around. Like there's some things that just the design doesn't change, for decades because it has reached its kind of like it's like, I don't know, like a glass to drink out of. Like they're still the same, like a ceramic cup. Like it didn't need to be iterated. It's done. That these groups will all kind of ultimately get to that place. Should we dive into more about this like 17th Street project? Can you talk about what it is? And then let's jump into the promise of our conversation is that we can get through this like sort of A to Z of like if you're an individual citizen, you want a bike lane or a tree or anything on public land, like what's the A to Z of steps to get there?
Yeah, well, let's start with defining there's kind of two different ways that I see projects happen through government. One would be kind of a top-down process where the government itself says, we're going to do a project. Here's the project. Here's the funding for it. Let's do it. And community involvement is kind of seen as a necessary evil, but not integral to the project. The other method, which is what I'll be talking about today, is community-led development. So the community identifies that there's a project, and the community works with itself and the government to identify here are possible alternatives to what exists today, and then we work through that system to have an outcome that we want. So that is the model that we were trying with 17th Street. And I'll take a step back. Prior to this, I had been involved as a volunteer on the JFK Boulevard project to convert that into a car-free space. So I was not a leader in that movement, but I learned a lot. And so a lot of what I learned from KidSafe, the organization that was running that campaign, I then have applied to the 17th Street project with other advocates, namely Peter Belden and Donovan Lacey were other folks that were very helpful in kind of executing this community-led strategy. So let's start with the beginning. The beginning is identifying a project and why there's a need for it. So I call that the problem statement, and it's a very similar analogy to startup pitching. There's a lot of similarities in the way that you pitch a problem statement and a potential solution. So let's talk about the problem statement for a bit. This area of 17th Street between Potrero and Mississippi is right where Potrero Hill is. And it's one of the most popular routes to go from the Mission District to Mission Bay. And why is that a problem? Well, previously, before this project, there was a shoulder bike lane. Folks in the Netherlands will call them murder strips. They are essentially
shoulder bike lane.
An unprotected bike lane. So in between parked cars and the travel lane for motor vehicles, you have this like 2 or 3 feet in the door zone for bicyclists.
Oh, pretty much how it's always, they're all like that pretty much, aren't they? Except you have the sidewalk, then you have cars, and then you just ride your bike like in this little narrow between the cars and the parked cars, and if someone opens the door at you, you just
Exactly.
taken out.
Exactly. And I think, 20 years ago, that was seen as progressive. Like, great, we have a lane for bikes. But what we see is that that's not safe for all, like, users of all ages and abilities. So there's an age group that is A, comfortable, and B, is capable athletically of dodging the doors or being conscious and careful of an oversized vehicle like a truck in the travel lane, which restricts the width of that bike lane. But that is not an acceptable situation, for me at least, for my kids, or for people with limited abilities. So as we look at volume of travel, what we observed, especially during the pandemic, is that there is a really large use of this by cyclists and scooter riders, specifically at all hours of the day for medical professionals to get to the various hospitals in Mission Bay. And during the pandemic, this was a big issue because for a long time, the perception was that public transit was unsafe. And so you had lots of people who chose an alternative to cars, which was scooters and biking, that had very unsafe conditions, which was exacerbated by the increase of demand during the pandemic. So all these things were coming to a head, and local community members, including myself, said, there might be a better way. And that's kind of the next step of what do we identify as the solution. But before we even get there, the problem statement needs more work. So that's like a hypothesis, right? That I have this idea, and so did the other community members. But then the next step is we engage to validate with other people that this is truly a problem. So who are those other people? Those are residents, businesses, and the users of the roadway themselves. So that's you can call it a systemic process that's complicated, or you could also look at it like as simple as talking to your neighbors, because that's basically what it is. And what you're looking for is validation, like, do other people think this is an issue? And then to get them to be comfortable sharing their story, and then to start assembling the narrative together of the problem statement before you even look at the solution. And I think that's another important element that I encourage a lot of advocates or activists to consider is before you jump to solutions, the first step to getting a project off the ground is to have an agreement with the key stakeholders that there's a problem that needs to be solved. And sometimes by jumping to a solution first, you turn off or you risk disengagement of people who would help validate the problem. And I'll give a very specific example, which is businesses will often not agree with the solution, but they totally agree that there's a problem. And at the right stage of the project, it is really helpful, even if they don't agree with your vision of where it's going, to say, we as a business have issues with loading and unloading, and we perceive to be safety issues in the way that automobiles and pedestrians and cyclists interact. Regardless of the solution that you may disagree with, having them on board to say that there's a problem is super valuable. And by separating the problem statement from possible alternatives, you do a better job of getting the community on board to at least rally around there could be a better way before you get wrapped around the axle on what is that better way, and do we all agree on what that solution might be?
Oh, yeah, that's such a well-articulated and nuanced insight, Kieren, to explain that. Because, like, how often, just in every part of life, like, or every part of environmental advocacy, everyone's just like, we have to do this. And then, like, maybe you actually don't have to do it that way. And also that, like, we're talking about the more, like, emotional kind of, like, qualitative part of, like, just getting everybody's mindset in the right place is to just really start with everybody agreeing to that problem and creating that kind of cohesion. And the solution might end up being something that's just maybe not exactly different, but a little bit different. So yes, that clearly identifying the problem. And what about like data? Tim was talking about how he used like a Raspberry Pi and a device to start like counting traffic. Like, did you do anything like that to create data and create stories?
Yeah, that's a great example of a tactic to start having more objective data that goes beyond people's individual statements. Other examples are recording or observing conflicts between road users. So for a traditional like bike safety improvement project, if you're a staff member at these agencies, you actually part of your job is you go out there and you observe like for an hour or two, and how many instances of near misses or near collisions did we see? As an advocate, you can also do this, and totally, it's an excellent method What I usually see is a manual process. Like, you just sit on the corner and you just start tagging things. A key part of that is collecting data about usage. So who is using that and what modes? And almost always what happens is that even the hippie cycle advocates will be surprised by the mixture of modes and how it is not just automobiles. And because an automobile literally takes up so much space, you think that the number of trips are high on a car relative to other sources. But when you actually look at this data, it can be very surprising. And especially at certain times of day, like late at night, when you have service workers that are returning who don't have automobiles, you can have a street that looks almost empty. But when you're counting, it's like, wait, there's 3 people on a scooter that just went by, 4 pedestrians, a cyclist, and then there's a truck. So yes, objective, data collection is super helpful, and then provides evidence of, here's what we observed, so that if you have naysayers that claim, we don't have any bicyclists. Well, actually, or that there's no parking available. Well, actually, so the other thing is doing parking studies. This is super boring, but, systemically at certain times of day, observing parking usage, what's the how often do they turn over? How often are there empty spaces, occupied spaces as well? Because often that is the opposition. And so collecting that data objectively to show capacity helps, fend off opposition you may have in the future.
Yeah, because I feel I'm like just crazy in the head about parking where I live in Mountain View, because we have all surrounded by where I live are these mammoth parking lots that are mostly empty. It drives me insane. And you know what the South Bay is like? Like, it's just very car, kind of centric style of design. And I'm just like walking through them, just being like, why? We could have and there's no bike path. And El Camino is one of the most dangerous roads.
Totally.
There's you know what they do? Little tiny signs. The signs are like this big. You can't see, because people are listening. I don't know. What is this big? What is it? 30 inches across by 20 inches or something?
Yeah, not big. Yeah.
Stuck into the soil, like as if a car could even see them. I see them because I don't have a car and I'm bike only. That says stop deaths in Mountain View, stop people dying, because there's literally multiple people die a year on El Camino. It's not safe to walk on. There is literally no bike path. But yet, somehow there is these huge parking lots that are mostly empty. And this is one of the most expensive zip codes in all of America. So somehow this land, which is apparently extremely expensive, and all the houses that range sort of between $2 and $5 million for a regular house, but we have all of this asphalt space. It just drives me insane. So
it is crazy.
If I was to do it, to take this back to our process, I could do a parking survey and I could show people, maybe photograph it multiple times a day, do a car count, and basically say this is empty most of the time. Can we please turn it into a park or a bike, and just get some data to kind of back up my story?
Exactly. Yes. And it's really that simple. And it really is that simple. It's different times of day so that you have a record of it. And then when people have these emotional arguments about needing parking, you can acknowledge that feeling, but then come back to, well, here's what I observed. And here's the data that we collected. Did you collect different data?
So it sounds like with this whole problem, you're differentiating the problem phase from the solution phase. That if I was going out and talking to people in my community, I would do that talking and that liaison conversations totally while I'm in the problem stage, before I'm even in the solutions phase at all.
Yes.
I should be out. I should make a milestone for myself that I've had 20 conversations before I even go near the solution.
I think that's a good strategy, especially for what you're sharing publicly, because the other thing that can happen sometimes if you lead with a solution, if someone disagrees with your solution, then they use it as a lightning rod for negativity and they spread that around their network. So they, if you're just leading with the bike lane, they're going to say, we don't want bike lanes on this street. And they'll start a petition that says no bike lanes on whatever street before the stuff has even begun. So politically or strategically, that can also be helpful. Because to be honest, let's be honest, we're advocates and we do have an agenda. And for me, the agenda is fewer internal combustion engines and more people using active travel. So my solution will be something that I'm suggesting as a bike lane or an active mobility lane. But you don't need to start with that at the beginning. And especially if it's a politically contentious environment, the first step is building as large of a coalition as possible that agrees with the problem statement, and then being honest about working together to find the compromise that's going to be the answer. And then you can put on your advocate hat and advocate for those things that you personally believe in. But that's at the next step, a further stage of this process.
Yeah, wow. This is like a really cool, just such an interesting nuance to dive into. But so for me, with this massive parking lot that is across the road from El Camino, from my apartment, like in my problem statement in my mind, it's just that I hate it. Like
That's a good start.
I love nature and I hate asphalt.
That's a great start.
I don't think people are dying in this parking lot, but I know they are dying on El Camino. And I know I can't ride my bike with my daughter along El Camino safely and my dog. I do it occasionally for a block, and it's kind of nerve-wracking, and I'm a super confident cyclist because there's poles in the way and sometimes pedestrians walk the other way, and it's genuinely about as bad as it could be.
Yep.
It's as bad as you could be with having a little narrow strip of concrete that you can actually walk on. To take that away would be worse. And it's a huge, there's 4 lanes on either side, so it's at least 8 lanes.
Yep.
How would I get near a problem statement apart from just like, I hate asphalt, but I love nature?
Good question. So then we can kind of transition into what are the general categories of solutions and what are the legal structures to deliver them? So let's use your example. What I'm hearing are 2 different legal structures. One is that there may be a private entity that owns a parking lot, and there's a public roadway, which is a shared right-of-way. So while we as humans will definitely share a similar problem statement and perhaps even a similar solution, unfortunately, the reality is that those, when we start thinking about how we come up with alternatives, we do have to keep the reality of those legal structures in place. So then I'll return to the example of 17th Street. So the next step, we have this problem. The next step is to essentially define the project area. And that's actually really hard because you can have a lot of differing opinions about what is this project area? Is it this whole neighborhood? Is it 5 blocks? Is it the entire stretch of the street? And it doesn't have to be perfect, but it really does help then to focus on what is a feasible area that we're able to change or impact. And this also includes the legal structure of the areas that we're talking about. And so, although I hate to say this, I think the reality of your example would be that there may be 2 completely separate processes for different use of that parking lot and the different configuration of that roadway. And they could be informed by each other, but that's part of the arc of this next step is what is the project with a capital P that we want to start aligning over? And there's no right answer. Like the legal framework is one example of this, but there could be political realities or the community itself is saying, we need to park here. We don't care who owns the land. It's just, that's the important thing. So it's also, your beliefs, the political reality, the legal structure kind of goes into what is a feasible, a first attempt at defining what that project area is. Again, we haven't come up with a solution yet. We're just saying, here's the physical area that kind of bounds the problem space, which then really does help be realistic about what solutions can exist in that area.
Right. Yeah. And in this example I bring up, it very much is a combination of the sidewalk, which is the public land, and the private land. So I know what the solution is in my mind. It would have to be a hybrid because 50% of the parking lot should be taken away because it's way too big. And then part of that parking lot should be a bike path and a walking path through nature. Like in my mind, that's what the solution is.
Yeah, I would agree that would be the most ideal, sort of outcome.
That is hybridizing. It's kind of then using private land for a public bike path. And
all these things, they could happen. So to be honest, it's totally feasible. I am jumping ahead to, which I'm doing it prematurely. I'm already optimizing the project success by focusing the area on one legal process at a time. That's kind of like where I jump automatically to, well, there's the street process and then there's the private property process. But it doesn't have to be. Like you can say your goal is for this area, which includes both public property and private property, that we're going to do a project. Totally cool. Like that's also a possibility, but it may be more challenging because you have multiple entities that have legal framework for not changing their space. So you have like double the battle. So part of that is kind of figuring out where do you have the effort to make that change? So it's a hard one. So honestly, choosing the project area is really important and really hard. And that strongly impacts the scope of possible solutions that you can get into with the community and the local municipality.
Do you have any thoughts on whether it would be more advantageous to err on only government land, or if you see something like what I see, which clearly needs like a hybrid approach, or you might be better off just working with a private developer?
So one way to answer that question is to go back a step to the problem statement and to essentially do the research to see how aligned are these different actors with my problem statement. Do they see this as a problem or do they not? So for example, I'm just role-playing here. It may be that the city government says, we acknowledge this is a high injury corridor. That's something they can say legally. However, it may be that the property owner says, I'm a multinational that owns 500 commercial real estate properties in the suburbs, and we have a standard equation that we use for parking capacity, and we followed it, and great. We're happy with that. So, that might be a realistic outcome when you talk to those stakeholders that may then influence, hey, that unfortunately restricts the scope of a potential solution. Or you may find out, hey, the private property owner has been looking for a way to get community grant money so that they can change, because they're not going to do it for free, but maybe if there's money available, they would be open to a repurposing of some private space in exchange for community improvements or benefits that they receive.
Yeah, or even selling it like it'll bring more traffic. Like traffic doesn't need to only be from cars. It'll increase, like you can find all different ways of telling how it could benefit them.
Totally. And then, this is political work, which is relationship building. Then it's partially relationship building and seeing how open they are to that problem statement of your portion of facilities is out of line with the proportion of your customers. So if you're dedicating X number of acres to automobile infrastructure, yet 0.0 for any other mode, maybe that's a problem. And that's part of the art of this process of figuring out, can you have that positive relationship with people that may very well be your opponent in the project in the future? And how do you deal with that in a way that doesn't set them off or trigger them at the beginning and actually can make them into a partner and an advocate, because it's in their best interest once you have that conversation.
Yeah. And it came up with, when we were talking about Tim, is this idea of foot in the door technique. Do you know that? Are you familiar with that term?
No, tell me more.
Oh, foot in the door technique is it means that when you ask somebody for a very tiny ask, and we kind of all intuitively do foot in the door technique. It's always like, you don't go and ask somebody like, can I please have $20,000 to do a thing, like to your partner or sister or whatever. You'd be like, I was wondering if I could have a conversation, and then you have I was wondering if I could ask you a question. Is it okay if the question is really big? And you kind of ladder up these little tiny asks to get to are you prepared for me to ask you something big and scary that you might not like right now? In terms of when you're building these relationships with potential adversaries, you're not basically going to them asking for a big ask. You're just saying, would you be interested in having a conversation? You learn this in sales, about it doesn't even have to be about roads. It can be just, would you have a conversation about the local community?
About their business. How well is your business doing? What are the challenges that you're facing?
Yeah, then just chat about that and be like, would you be interested in talking about how people get into your store?
Yeah.
And then
how we can increase foot traffic.
Yeah, is it how many are coming? And then just ask how many are coming from cyclists, how many are coming from pedestrians, how many are coming from cars? And then you just sort of staggering up these conversations to lead to something quite big. And that's what you really learn in sales. It's fundamental technique of just, they call them little yeses. I had a sales CEO I hired for my old media company, and he would always be with the team, and he'd be like, tiny yeses. Just get people to agree, is it a nice day? How's business? And then you just stagger up till basically you're asking them for $100,000.
That's right. That's right.
Cool. Okay, well, in the 17th Street, what's the next step? We've got project area. What's next?
Problem statement, and then the project area. And then we want to announce it. So we want people to be aware that there's a problem statement in the project area and that there's a group of people that want to find the solution. And so that's old-fashioned marketing. So it's spinning up a website, starting to create an email list, and then doing the work that continues after the research stage to find other people that are interested in this issue. And that can be a short process of just put up a website. It could be a long process where you do lots of community outreach and actually engage in those discussions. So that begins the community outreach process. The next stage is the community input process for the potential range of solutions. And this is the big one, right? This is where we start to think about how do we respectfully take community feedback, but also think about the people that are not there, that don't have the means to provide that community feedback, and mix them together to create some alternatives. And here is when you as the community activist do have to step out on that ledge and propose alternatives, some of which may not be popular. And part of the art of this process is to use language like potential alternatives or multiple alternatives so that you're not saying it must be this way or that way. And similar to your easy yeses, what's very helpful is to include in these alternatives an alternative that is barely anything different at all. So an example would be for infrastructure safety project that, you know what, we're not going to be able to remove any parkings. We can't add the bike lane, but maybe we could have more stop signs and pedestrian crossings and bulb outs so that there's more curb and less width. So I don't think that's the ideal outcome as an advocate for safe streets, but that's better than nothing.
So that could be kind of like your foot in the door version of all the outcomes. If they get,
Yes. And then you can add additional options that become more aggressive or progressive, that have removing lots of parking, removing all the parking, what's that right level in between? And then you could even, if you're being really Machiavellian about this, you can have spoilers that are just way too progressive that nobody will want, and then they'll agree to something in between. But I don't think you have to go to that level. I think it's really being honest about what do you think is an alternative as the organizer putting a lot of labor into this? And then what are you hearing from other businesses that might be, or community members, I should say? There's a bias in San Francisco toward business organizations, so that's why I keep automatically coming back to that. What I believe is that members of the community who live there are as or more important than just what the business owners have to say. But unfortunately, in San Francisco, that's a political reality where you often are catering to them. So back to what we're doing, we're then coming up with those alternatives. Now becomes the art of getting different folks to think about that, to discuss that. And it's exactly the stuff we were talking about at the beginning, which is engaging people in this conversation about those alternatives. And in that discussion, you're going to have people that are angry and that don't support it. And there's different strategies to deal with that. But it's the reality of the work that we're doing. The good news is you will also have people that love this, and there is totally positive energy that you're going to find. The key is to make sure that you remind yourself that there's supporters and positivity and people that will benefit from this, even when you get folks that are frustrated at the fear or the loss aversion of imagining they can never find a place to park. So this is a hard stage because what you then transition to is what seems feasible within the reality. And there's no right answer. So I will give you the example of 17th Street, but it will be different for the example you're providing in the South Bay. It will be different for folks that are in other regions that have different structures. So what I'll explain is how do we do it in San Francisco? And one of the questions is, what is the agency that's responsible for this? So in San Francisco, that's the SFMTA. That is a city agency. It sounds like a simple question, but it's actually very different in very different regions. Sometimes it could be a county authority. Sometimes it could be a state authority, depending upon the type of roadway. And these are not always simple things to discern. You have to do research, even ask your city, et cetera, because that really changes the strategy of the alternatives you're going to provide and the people that you're going to start to involve in this sort of conversation.
Okay, so what agency looks after? So in San Francisco, the FMTA, they run all of the BART and the buses. They actually manage the roads, the physical, the actual asphalt and concrete on the road as well.
That's right.
They do the whole thing.
That's pretty common for larger municipalities where you have an agency that's responsible for transportation at the highest level, and that includes transit and street road infrastructure as well. But then you have these weird cases, even in San Francisco, where there's certain streets like Van Ness that goes right through the city that is technically Caltrans, it's a state DOT right-of-way. So the city can't just do something by itself. That would be an example of a street that actually has multiple layers of process and jurisdiction for making those changes. So at this stage, we don't want to get wrapped around the axle on it, but it's critical to identify, hey, here's the agency. And then as an advocate, one of the first steps is just to literally reach out to the agency and start to engage in conversations about what are you thinking about this? Is this on your high injury corridor network? Have you ever thought about this? Have you heard about these problem statements? Or are they new to you? And being able to lead with problem statements that have attributions to the community, at the very least, gets you in the door. It's the foot in the door to have an awesome conversation with the majority of transportation professionals that work for a city. They will appreciate that. They will say to you, wow, thank you for collecting all this feedback and summarizing it for me in this coffee meeting, as opposed to me needing to spend weeks of my own labor doing that.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. When you say attributions, do you mean feedback and input from the community?
Yeah, exactly.
Is that what you mean by that word, attribution?
I just mean that, like, you're not just making it up. So you're not just someone there complaining. Instead, you're saying, here is the synthesis of real life humans and their feedback about this problem.
Right.
And your foot in the door is just, have you heard about this problem? Does this seem like a problem to you? And how would you think about dealing with this problem? And because you have now the power of the community behind you, it's much easier to get those agencies to engage with you. And that is also true for the other layers. So one layer is the agency of staff members who are, employees of the city. The other layer is the political layer. And that also is very different for different municipalities or counties or regions. So in San Francisco, we have our legislative body, which is the Board of Supervisors. They're elected for each district. And then we have the executive branch, which is the mayor. And they both have control and power, but in different ways. In San Francisco, the supervisor of that district is often seen as the person that is going to greenlight a project. They have, in theory, the authority to decide if they're doing something in that area or not. However, legally, the mayor has a lot of power because they essentially appoint the leader of that department. And so they can also put pressure on that department. So this is part of the politics process as you say, hey, we've identified a problem. What are the agencies that are, accountable or responsible? And what are the elected officials? And what is the interplay of power there so that we understand who are the people that would have to say yes to whatever the solution is? And there's terms like a power map or other processes you can go through. But at the end of the day, what you're really asking is, if this goes the way I want it to, who has to say yes? Who has to support this in order to get the funding, the legal approval, the staff time, whatever it may be? And that's kind of what you're setting up for next.
A power map. I mean, that sounds good because whenever anyone describes government to me, I just go you hear mumbo jumbo, blah, blah, blah. I've had the California government explained to me so many times with all of its different agencies, and I still just have I just can't fix it in my mind into a shape. So you need to, if that's one of the steps to do, is to make this power map. And so
it's something that,
sort of like a diagram of so in San Francisco, you've got these districts, which are kind of like a neighborhood, but they're a bit bigger than a neighborhood.
Yes.
You've got, and each one of them, and I know they have numbers, don't they? 1, 2, 3, 4. And you may have several neighborhoods to a district. And then the district has a manager, but also a board of supervisors, a little section of San Francisco.
Yeah, each district. So I live in D9, which is the Mission District, and we have a supervisor. Her name is Hillary Ronan. So she's supervisor of this district. And then they all also meet as a legislative body that can also pass legislation. But in practical terms, a lot of their day-to-day is dealing with neighborhood issues and kind of being the voice of the community.
Okay, so they can sign off maybe on some of these changes?
Their word matters. So staff pay attention to them. They often do have certain forms of budget that we can get to in a second that they will greenlight. And when we talked about the word power map, I think what's helpful to think about is that all we're saying is to do a brainstorm of all the different people or entities that might engage with your project. And the first step is just getting them out of your head or doing the research to find what they are. And then, I didn't invent this, it's some other term you can probably research, but then the power map is kind of how are these things connected and who has the power to be able to say yes or no to your project. And of those that do have that power, what are the connections they have to other organizations or people who they trust or who they listen to or will react to? And the power that we have is that very often the answer is the community itself. And so we have, part of our power as advocates is a respectful process to catalog what are the community needs, and then to be able to present that in a way that is respectful, but also clearly states the need to make change in that jurisdiction.
I mean, you could call it like just decision maker channels as well. Like where
Yes.
are the decision maker channels
Totally.
and the budget?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to slice it. So like you're saying, it could be more procedural as to like, what are the steps that we needed to change this? And who are those people? And therefore, those are the people that, or their organizations that I need to spend time with and focusing on.
Do you have any advice for that to not be overwhelming? Because honestly, for me, thinking about that, I kind of feel like I wilt and just want to like give up when I think about having to map out the bureaucracy of like a city government. Although it's something that I deeply want to do, it's just like, oh God.
I think the good news would be that you don't have to do all of this at once. And that if there's a real problem, and you find this out by doing your neighborhood outreach, if there's a real problem that people agree on, the legislative, government stuff can be a future stage. I guess my point is it cannot be ignored. Like it is critical at a certain point in the process. And I'll give you a very critical or literal example for 17th Street, which is that project is in one district. That's District 10. It does not cross multiple districts. And one of the reasons of many is that it's difficult to get these projects approved in the first place. And it makes it much more difficult if you have to run that process multiple times. So that's like, you should be in the imaginary world of anything's possible, but then you reach this certain point when you start talking about alternatives, when, you meet reality and have to understand what are the abilities to execute. An example in your region is that there's so many small towns and cities that in your mind, obviously it's the same street, but from a project perspective, you would have no idea, but, oh, that's the county line, and oh, that's the city line, and that means our project can only be 3 blocks, not 7, and you'd have to work with the other city for the other thing. So it comes up, but I would encourage waiting on that until after you've defined, hey, is the problem really here? And do I have a consortium of people that will back me up to say that this is really a problem that's worth our time to fix?
And maybe the power map and the decision maker channels actually isn't that hard to do.
No.
Like I made it through an engineering degree. Like I can map out a government. It's sort of like this boogeyman in my mind of this like horrible bureaucratic mess. But maybe I should just realize it's just a few steps. It's not that hard. You can figure it out.
Yeah, and I like thinking about it as like, you're not going to get it right the first time. So it's just like, just put it on, Canva or a piece of paper and like kind of a mind map thing of like, what are all the potential organizations that are involved? Is there a transit agency? Are there elected officials? Who are they? When do they get reelected? If you want to go deep into that, who do you know that they know? All this sort of stuff if you go deep down the rabbit hole. But again, at first, it's just like, what are the entities that you know of? And then part of your community outreach is asking other people. You don't have to do it all yourself. Ask other people to help you fill that in. Or if you can get that coffee with the transportation engineer to provide that community feedback, ask them. Like, who else is going to need to be involved in this process for this to move forward?
Yeah, and one thing that I think people don't realize is just how powerful LinkedIn is for this. Like, I can get in touch with just about anyone through LinkedIn. Like, if you look up your local city, it does really powerful searches. You can look up the local organization. You can put in a keyword like traffic, bike, climate, sustainability, and it will have the people there. And if you have a reasonable LinkedIn profile, you don't look like a crazy person. You look like a nice professional person who's engaged. I mean, they will most likely respond to your request. Yeah. And then you can have a lot of people just don't realize that how powerful LinkedIn is for finding the specific person you want to get to. They just don't even know that what a good tool it is.
That's right. Yeah. And often I observe negative interactions on social media like Twitter or Facebook between the public and city officials. And to your point, LinkedIn is an area that is very positive and constructive. Like, instead of people complaining a lot, it's where you put your professional self out there. So platforms like that can be super effective for interacting with government officials.
Yeah. And just finding anyone, really, just making networks with anyone. I think it's an amazing tool. Okay, so we've mapped out the decision maker processes and which agency. What's next?
So the ultimate thing we're looking for is that we arrive on a solution that's feasible that then we're going to need to get support for. And to be really honest, there is no one plan to go from problem and potential solutions to finding that one solution. In fact, I would say that is the hardest part. And that is where you as an advocate who lives in that community are most empowered to work that. So it can be as simple as, you know what, everyone kind of agrees that we need a bike lane. It could be as complicated as there's vast disagreement and we have to have these alternatives and multiple discussions with community stakeholders. And it may be that the end solution that you as the advocate who are running this process comes up with will be 80% popular, but 20% of people will hate it. And that's the reality of some of these things. So I can give examples of tactics to get to that final, but I can't tell you exactly what's going to work. But here's examples. In addition to having the website, then you have email sign up for a newsletter. You can do in-person or virtual calls where you start to talk through the alternatives and get the engagement, to your point, where the folks are actually, whether it's using Street Mix or 3D Street or paper and pencil or construction paper or Legos, like the method doesn't matter. What matters is that you're getting that engagement and you're proving to them that you're taking their feedback and synthesizing it into what that solution is. And what I can't tell you with confidence is how long that should take. You know, it could be very quick if everyone's aligned. It could be months. It could be years. Like these things take time. And that's, you know, there's so many factors that go into that. But other tactics or methods is, and this is what I've done with other projects as well, and we did with 17th, which is to do a lot of time out there, like literally out there. And what that means is you get people to sign up on a sheet of paper that says, you know, their name and their email address and that they'd like to receive updates. You also are using that opportunity to engage with them and to collect more feedback from folks about what changes they'd like to see. And then if you're at the point where you have alternatives, then you can show the different alternatives and get feedback on those specific things. And that's a process that is very helpful throughout all stages, the beginning, middle, and end, is to do a lot of, you know, boots on the ground, actually at the project area or in the neighborhood, collecting that feedback. This is actually what worked really well for us. So we would choose commute times when especially medical professionals would be on their bikes in the morning and the evening. And this was super successful because then we have people that worked at well-known hospitals. And then the technique was, let's go to people at those hospitals who have the authority to make a commitment or an endorsement of a plan. So that's another thing. Like, hey, I found the individuals that support this. Now I'm going to go to the organizations they're associated with and also get an organizational endorsement. And luckily, we had friends that work for UCSF that really appreciate the need for healthy transportation. So it was in line with their vision. And that was another organization that was really helpful to get on board. So then we get into the phase where we have the preferred community alternative. We could call it that.
Sorry, Kieren, can I just ask you, when you sort of said boots on the street, collecting people, do you just mean like you literally stand on a street corner and just talk to random people walking by and you have like people that ask for signatures? You're not asking for signature though, you're just asking them and talking to them?
We can be asking for their email, yes, because it does help to build an email list so that we can do future communication. And when we get to the later stages, we do need a big email list because we're going to have those supporters email the decision makers, whether it's elected officials and or staff. So it is very intensive.
And do you also ever talking door to door people? Housing?
Sometimes. Usually, this is my bias, but I would say that with businesses, it's helpful to go there, go door to door. With community members, what we find is that the people that are most supportive of changes are the actual road users. And so that's where we find that we sit at a traffic light on the intersection, like at the intersection of where the project is, and wait for the red lights. And then cyclists come, we talk to them, and then pedestrians as well. And then like everyone in that demographic is like, gosh, we need lots of improvements to this situation. So it takes time, but it's real, like it's genuine. You're actually getting the community to provide that.
And how many hours have you done that in your life?
I don't know. I only did it for maybe 5 or 6 hours for 17th. There were a lot of other volunteers that did a lot more. And JFK, we did a lot of door-to-door. That was actually a proposition, so we had to get voters. And then for another, like a stormwater management project, we got a grant for community outreach, and I've done, 80 hours, 120 hours, something like that. It's a lot of work, but it's also like super fun. Like if you get into it, you have an excuse to meet everyone in your neighborhood in a really positive way. And even if they disagree, 9 times out of 10, it can be it's still a positive conversation where you smile at them on the street when you walk by, and you may disagree about parking policy, but you know your neighbor, and that's okay.
Yeah, Griff, it's one I usually, for this podcast, interview academic environmental psychologists. And the thing that comes out over and over again is just conversations with neighbors are more powerful than anything, or friends and neighbors. It's gonna be more powerful than any single other of the 20 or 30 kind of things in the toolkit for getting people to change the way they think. But here's the thing. I think the idea for most people when they hear about it, that you need to stand on a street corner and just approach random strangers who may be on a bicycle or a scooter or walking and then just start up conversations, I think that is terrifying, and people intensely will want to do it and be really shy. And like to try to get your own, like get up and go, to be like, I'm going to get up today and I'm just going to do that. Like unless somebody's like pulling you along, it's terrifying. And
it's hard.
But what I think is also really cool what you said is that it's actually really fun. I mean, I had an experience of that, feeling like, oh my God, I've got to go door to door in my neighborhood. I can't think of anything worse and more terrifying. Like, so like I'll throw up before I go and like knock on random strangers' doors, even though they live across the road from me. But when you actually do it, it was genuinely super fun. Like there were way more cool people in my neighborhood than I realized. A couple of people were weird. I felt great afterwards. Could you just go into a little bit more about how people need to not be scared and to just get over that hump of fear of doing what is legitimately proven by research to be the most powerful thing that changes anything? And if we can't do this, like we can't do anything. That it's good, it's not bad.
Exactly. Well, I'll tell you the technique I use. And I used to be in marketing, and a lot of what we would do was booths at trade shows. And I develop a persona at trade shows where I say hi to everyone and I engage in conversation with everyone. And it helps me to think about that as a persona and not always just me. So, it's almost like the proverbial, I put on my hat to do my booth persona. And that's the same persona that I bring to advocacy, because you want to be nice. You want to engage someone in a positive conversation. You do want their contact information. And you do want their genuine feedback about your proposal, the problem statement, or the product or service that you're offering if you're in the B2B context. I have found that improv comedy is the best way for people to get practice with this and to feel more comfortable.
So not only do you need to stand on a street, now you need to go to a comedy club and practice improv. No way, no one's going to do that. Yeah.
Improv comedy is such a fun thing. There's organizations all over the world. No joke, I would seriously recommend that. And the improv comedy I've been to, it's usually like in a small group. It's not public performances. It's more like 8 to 12 people with an instructor, over a series of, maybe 2 months. And that really helps you with just being comfortable to approach people and not worry about it. Like just go ahead and do it.
So it's a class. It's not like you have to actually go to a club and get booed off stage.
No. It's not about that. It's about being able to be very quick with your words and not overthink it, and just try it out and to be silly. And almost always the general public, people on the street, they're not there to give you a hard time. They're humans too. And so, if you're approaching them with something, unless you're like being rude or crazy, they're going to listen and respond, be polite.
Yeah, but you said it's genuinely enjoyable. Like after you've done it, you've got to know all these people, you've had all these conversations. It wasn't this like a hugely nerve-wracking experience to talk to strangers. Like once you get into the flow of it, it's actually, you have a great time.
I have a great time. And I will also say it's work. So at the end of that, I feel tired. I've spent all this emotional energy, time. And so it's not to say it's without sacrifice, but it's enjoyable work. It's actually getting out there and meeting your neighbor. It's not just sitting in front of a computer thinking about theoretical designs that may or may not work in reality.
And I just love your idea of like your community engagement persona is like a persona that you put on, because a lot of us, are sort of insecure and shy, and we think, oh my God, they're just going to think I'm a loser and I'm so awkward.
The answer is some of them will, and that's okay.
Yeah. But, like when you're at work, like if you're at a job, like a customer service job, like you might have a uniform, a name tag, you're sort of dressed up in your professional way and you're like dealing with customers, you're in your work self. Like it's quite okay. You can create something like that so you're in your kind of work self?
Totally. Yeah, for me, it's literally things like I have a clipboard. I have things that are like a uniform. I didn't have a shirt. Actually, for JFK, we did. We did have a shirt for that campaign. But even little things like that, you have your clipboard, you have your talking statements, you have your sign-up sheet. Sometimes you have a sign or something that you put up next to you so people see that as they're approaching. And those things do help with, okay, I'm in this mode. I'm going to smile at people. We'll try it out. And then you get into it. And then you're like, why don't more people show up? I want more bicyclists coming by.
Yeah, I mean, it just made me think. I've started doing this pop-up Hello Kitty cafe with my daughter. She's 9. You met her, didn't you, Anastasia, at the dinner?
Yes, that's right.
Because I sell them at Walmart. It's like a small food truck.
Oh, cool. Like a little mini food truck, yeah.
Yeah. So it's legit. Like it goes 5 miles an hour.
What?
It's big enough
like
to
Power
use.
Wheels.
Yeah, it's strong. You have to actually run after it if the kids like start going fast.
Hilarious.
And they can't hear you because it's so loud. So you literally have to like run. I've been chasing this pink thing around the truck. But she wanted it and I said, and it was $400. And I'm like, for a start, we live in an apartment. So you literally can't get it in and out very easily. But like, okay, I'll buy you the $400 truck on the deal that we make it a business. We're going to take it to the park and we're going to sell cupcakes.
Love it.
And it's got to make revenue, and this will be like your project. And we've been doing it every Sunday through almost a year now.
Wow.
And it's genuinely really fun. Like, because I'm usually doing like kind of fairly intellectually like intense work on my own, on my computer all day, or having like Zoom meetings and stuff. And then I get to like bake cupcakes, pull this like ridiculous pink Hello Kitty truck. I dress in full pink when I'm doing it. And it's covered with LEDs, and I have like a playlist, and it has a speaker on it, so it makes music, and it has a bubble machine. So it's this this large truck. Well, not large by like truck
large
sizes,
by Power
but
Wheel standards.
Large, yeah, like it's like almost not the size of a car. Maybe it's the size of 50% of a car.
Yeah.
That's blowing bubbles. That's playing like fun synth pop 80s music, and it's lit up with LEDs, and it's full of cupcakes and snacks. And so it's so fun. But anyway, the point I'm getting to is that when I'm out there at the park, I'm fully in my like pink outfit with all of this stuff. Like I'm talking to people for 4 hours straight, and I'm not my Katie Patrick self in that moment. Like I'm pink mom of Anastasia.
Yeah, and you pick
who's
up
like
on the energy.
who's helping my daughter sell cupcakes, and we put all the money in her bank account. And I'm just talking to all sorts of people about all sorts of things. They ask all different types of questions. They buy a cupcake, and it's super enjoyable and really social. None of it's very deep. And it's so easy for me to do that because I am this kind of other character in that moment.
Yeah.
I'm kind of like part of this like pink thing, and everybody's smiling. If I was like my normal weird sort of like nerdy, like eco kind of like indie hacker sort of self, I would actually be really awkward talking to that many people for that long in my normal persona. And so, yeah, I just thought that was a kind of a cool thing to like reflect on of like if you can create some sort of like entity for yourself, identity or kind of container to get you out of that shyness, which is this huge thing that, stops people from taking action in their communities.
Totally. Yep. So we can go on the next step of this exciting journey.
Yeah, sorry if my Hello Kitty example took us off time too much. One day I'll take it out to I'm dying to take it to San Francisco and sell cupcakes. You'll have to come and see us, and
yes,
I will give you and your children a cupcake.
That'd be cool.
Yeah. Okay. So So we're up to the solution, the engagement, talking to people on the street. What's next?
So then we transition into there's a preferred alternative. So we have kind of an idea based on a community feedback of what we think is the most likely outcome that's going to satisfy stakeholders and address the problem that we identified. So the next step is getting a big enough coalition to be able to make that move forward. So that's like the political support and the blocking and tackling of governmental process to find funding for this. So let's talk about that funding process. And that gets into the legislative or like the political structure. So in this case, we're talking about districts in San Francisco. And in our case, we have abilities for those supervisors to choose projects that they're going to support and put some sort of funding to them. There's also a program in San Francisco called Quick Build, which is a project from the MTA to identify corridors where, with no changes to the concrete, so just paint and posts, they can do a pretty rapid project at a low budget to be able to try some of these improvements or changes. Those are going to be different for each municipality. Sometimes the municipality has the money of its own. Sometimes it's a citywide program like the Quick Build. Sometimes there's possibilities to get federal grants or state grants. If you're working with a state agency, they may have money. This is not the easiest part. This is actually the hardest part, where you have the support, but now we have to navigate within the system. How do we find that? For our project, we really latched onto that Quick Build concept. It paved the way, pun intended, for it to be possible. But just because it's possible doesn't mean it's going to happen. So then the next step is, okay, we've identified, here's the program and the funding where it could come from. Here are the agencies and political officials that are responsible for making those decisions. Here's the support from the community that is proposing a specific outcome. Then comes the organizing. And so this is using the email list that you've built up. It's using those in-person conversations, which you may have to have a lot more of. Just start the groundwork to tell the city that it's time to make that decision. So this also gets into the dirty work of how are these programs done? In this case, the MTA needs to propose it and the supervisor needed to agree to it, or vice versa, either way. And so those conversations evolve into, hey, we've agreed on the problem statement. Now here's a solution. Meet with the agency. Hey, does this seem like a quick build thing that would qualify for that program? Yes, it could, but we need a supervisor support. So then you're also, as an advocate, working on, hey, to your supervisor, if there's funding for this, would you be open to this or supportive of it? And here's the community support. So with other projects I'm on right now, this is like the biggest, most difficult part of it. It really is finding the funding and structure, like the program structure, to make it happen. So even if you have all this community support, that's a prerequisite. It does not mean that it's going to happen. You are also finding what is the means for that to happen. Some projects, if you have a big enough constituency, can self-fund. So it can be possible to raise money for some types of projects. But for larger road infrastructure projects, it's not feasible, both because it's a large amount of money and also because very often cities just won't do that. They will not accept private money to do public right-of-way improvements. It's just not going to happen. So I'll pause there because we can dive more into it. But that's like a difficult stage to then find what's the mechanism that we can then bring this about.
Can you estimate like how many meetings and time it takes to figure that out? Because I've gone down this process before with different like software prototypes I've built, trying to get, you're also actively selling your software to governments as well. And I would just go round in circles, meeting with person after person that loved the idea, they loved the concept, loved the software, the tool. I wasn't selling a street redevelopment. I was selling sort of like my software tool or my solution. And then I would ask them like, who would have the budget, classic sales section. And most of them would just be like, I don't know. Like, I can't tell you how many of them, it would just be like, yeah, maybe you could talk to that person. And after being round in these circles, I was just like, I don't know if I've got it in me to make it through this spaghetti monster. Like, could you just set a bit of like maybe if you're in a small place, it's easier to make it through this thing, but I'm like dealing with like all the, the Bay Area and California, it's really big and complicated. Like just to set your expectations for how many meetings, how many emails and conversations you'll need to get to the end to work out this, what's often like quite a tricky spaghetti monster of like funding and bureaucracy.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's probably going to be hundreds of conversations and meetings over the lifespan of the project. And a lot of it is exploring what's possible. Another good technique is to look at what else has been done in this region, this municipality, that is similar in project description. And that really helps to also help staff and elected officials think through the fact that this is possible and feasible. So the example for 17th Street was looking at other quick build projects that had parking separated bicycle facilities. And using those projects, like literally having pictures of them, researching the timeline and the funding for them, researching how they were approved, then helps us with that plan that's a much more realistic plan. For the water project I'm working on, It's like lots of exploration with elected officials at different levels of government as well to find, what are the funding sources that are available for wastewater management? How do we start putting ourselves on the radar for these things? And although I'm presenting this as a rigid kind of step 1, 2, 3, 4 process, obviously these things can kind of happen at different times. And part of your advocacy work, even at the beginning, may be looking at, hey, what are the funding sources available? How are they connected to different types of government entities? And even before you have all the community support, it can really help to know, hey, here's the path that if we do have the support could be realistic for a project. But it kind of depends. It's okay to lead with the problem statement. It can also be okay to do a bunch of research and find how to build something or both. It just depends on you and the project you're trying to achieve.
Right. So you should just mentally prepare for having maybe, I don't think it would take 100 calls to figure out where the money comes from.
No.
No, but maybe that's, if you include all of the community engagement, I mean, just figuring out the money map of like
what are
how
the
many
options? Yeah, and then this also is like kind of sometimes thinking outside the box of, well, it looks like here's the budget that the city spends on repaving streets every year. Well, how do you decide which ones get repaved? And when you repave a street, can you restripe it or put new layout for that street? And usually the answer is yes. Like usually a repaving can prompt a relatively low cost restriping because they got to restripe it anyway. So you kind of learn about, hey, there's different opportunities where I could plug into it. But it does require kind of digging both at the like research online level, but also you really do have to engage with staff at some point because they're going to be the key to understanding what's possible.
Okay, let's say you've done this process, the budget's coming up, or for your bike lane on 17th Street, at some point they met and they approved the budget. Like, how did you submit it to them? I'm just assuming this is the next step, that you have to submit it through a formal process, and then they have a process where they review it, and then they assign the money, and then it goes into action.
Yeah, so it's, of course, never quite that simple, but basically, yes. And in this case, since Quick Build as a program existed, the political work was getting this corridor, this project, on the list. So that was the first step, like having it under consideration. And that required working with the district supervisor for them to say, hey, city agency, we want you to consider this route as one of the possible candidates for a quick build in the future. So that's one of the steps, even getting it considered.
Sorry, is the list like an official list, or is you just saying like what does it
have?
In
this case, does
it have a name?
In this case, it's very specific to San Francisco. They call it the Quick Build Program. And part of that process is they identify where are the future areas where there could be projects. And so one of those steps is to get the community support to show that this project area was worthy of being on that list. So it's not the end-all be-all, but it's part of that. And again, I use the example of repaving because I think even if cities don't have this quick build program, every city has a repaving schedule. And that's where you can get in the list. In other words, like understand what is the queue for the next repavings? How are those determined? If we have enough community support, can we have this as part of that? But that's where you have to explore and see what are the programs, because the reality is there is money available for streets. Like every city has tons of money for streets. Now it's usually used for automobile infrastructure. So the money's there, but part of the art is figuring out how do you get your projects to be part of that machine and prioritized. And that's both process, but also politics of getting that support.
Okay, so there is an official quick build list that you submitted your project to be on.
Yeah, and more accurately, it's the supervisor, so we have to help the supervisor be willing to have their staff tell the MTA, hey, please add this to the quick builds that you're considering for District 10 in the future. And even though that's not a guarantee, that's like, the first step, like is it even in there as something that could be approved? And then the next step is a lot of work to then get the city to approve it. So that's the next step.
Okay, and in this term of like the list, but what you're also saying is that every city has its version of the list, right?
Totally.
So it's going to come in different forms, but you've basically got to hunt through your city to find out what the list is, and you've got to get it on the list for consideration.
Totally.
And ask around how to do that.
Totally. And there's different methods even within the same city. Like San Francisco also repaves its streets, but it's a different department. It's not the SFMTA, it's some other department doing that. And you have to figure out that department's, what their schedule is. And then if you can have them coordinate with the SFMTA to do restriping. So it takes a lot of kind of digging and wonky municipal government stuff, but it's out there. Like in theory, all of these records should always be public. And therefore, if you're respectfully engaging with staff, they would rather have a quick chat than have to go through a whole legal process to sunshine this stuff. So that's another reason that staff will be open to talking about this stuff with you.
Okay, and then you've got to get, once it's on the list, you've got to get it approved. So being on the list is not a sure thing. You've got to still do work to get it from the list to having in a budget and signed off.
That's right. And in this example, for this program, being on the list is to say, hey, we're now going to have staff look at it and actually start to do staff work separate from our community activism to do a mirror image of a lot of the stuff we've already done. This is a little frustrating, but I think it's also important that then the municipality, the city government agency, the state or federal, whatever's working on this project, also runs their process to do proper community outreach. But usually, because you've done the legwork, you help them do it a lot faster. And whether they're aware of it or not, you're steering the community members that have engaged positively toward them so that they're getting the right signals that this is a project that the community is ready for and looking for as soon as possible.
Right, so you're kind of providing this positive reinforcement as they're kind of doing a more formal version of the initial, like, I don't know what you call it, pre-design sort of work.
Yeah, exactly. And then to our group, another tip, another thing that was really helpful was that this wasn't just a group out of the blue. This is actually part of the Potrero Dogpatch Neighborhood Association, and they had a livable streets team. And if there's the ability to work with a pre-existing organization, or like for my stormwater project, I'm working with the Sierra Club. So those do help to have like an entity that's kind of there from the beginning that can help provide some of that structure. And then that does help a little bit of the city taking you seriously when you're associated with one of those neighborhood groups. And then you can actually kind of partner with them and say, hey, we're going to have a community session that's co-organized by the city and this neighborhood group to bring officials in to talk about these alternatives. Because there is a city group like that, sometimes they have funding, like a neighborhood association. And sometimes they choose to use some of that funding to come up with visuals for the potential project. In this case, other members, not myself, were able to work with a planning organization, Mobicon, to do some pro bono concepting. So like if you don't have that, you use 3D Street and Street Mix. In this case, they were able to get folks on board to help pro bono to come up with some plans. Cities both love that and hate that. They actually love it because you're doing the hard work of putting things out there that the community may respond in unknown ways to. You're also helping them by actually doing some of their work for them by showing what are feasible designs. Now, often cities are not invented here methodology. They don't want to just take other people's work. They want to do it themselves. And so you do see some pushback of, oh, I don't want to see your ideas. I want to do it myself. But even when they say that, they actually like to see it because even if they come up with something different, those prototype designs really help them. So again, it's an art when we come up with our alternatives and how we get the city to approve it. But part of one of those ingredients could be helping them with some example designs or even detailed designs if that moves the process forward and makes the staff more likely to approve it.
Okay, and so they've done this survey, their own community engagement. They've come up with their own budget, and then is it just up to them? Do you just like hope it gets approved?
Good question. So that would be a naive way of doing it, to say, hey, great, it's on there. Oh, well, you'll get to it when you get to it. The reality is that until it's in the ground, think of the project as being canceled. Because very often what happens is that governments delay projects as a way to cancel them. And it's not nefarious. It's not like they're evil people. It's just like when a project is paused, it's canceled. Like that is the de facto thing. And so you as an advocate, unfortunately, even when it's in the city's hands and they say they're going to do it, it's just the next stage in the project. And so I'll share some of what goes wrong at this stage. One of the things that happens is that the city, if they're doing outreach properly, does engage with the press, or that the press sees that this is going on, and then they write an article about it. And usually that's the point at which there's negativity that's brought to it. And so then you, as the champion, your responsibility, if you choose to accept it, is to help through those stormy times when staff or elected officials may perceive, correctly or incorrectly, that there's too much negativity around this proposal. And this is where you need to have the coalition of both organizations and individual community members to be able to cut through the negativity, to reassure the elected officials and staff, often by the sheer power of numbers, that yes, in fact, the community does support this project. There may be detractors, but here's how we're dealing with that, or here's why that detractor should not be listened to, or for whatever reason. So that's an unfortunate reality that will be part of most processes, and it usually is about the time when it becomes an official city thing that really attracts the naysayers. And the city officials and the elected officials are going to be very skittish. So you have to help them feel comfortable and provide that shield around them that the work you're asking them to do really is supported by the community. And this is hard. And part of the calculus that goes into this when dealing with detractors is to think about how much time do you engage detractors? And there's no right answer, but sometimes the answer is stop engaging. That can be the answer. And sometimes the answer is it's okay to engage. And that just depends on lots of variables.
I mean, how much of a boogeyman is this phase? Is it like a really big, massive, like boulder in the way that's going to be one of the most significant things you need to plan for? Or do you get some where like there's hardly any detractors and it was really easy?
I think that I'm kind of reporting from my experience in San Francisco. For better or worse, this is a city where everyone wants their opinion to be heard. So it is the boulder. I like that analogy. And everything that we've been talking about before this phase is the buildup so that we have evidence and a widespread community that supports this project. And the reason we do all these pre-steps is because the boulder is going to come. And if we don't prepare for it, then that will stop the project.
So this is like the phase 8 in the hero's journey, where it's like the ordeal, where you're all leading up, the hero's leading up, and they're gathering all of their like allies and their destinations, and then there's like the big hard bit.
That's right.
This is the big hard bit.
This is the hardest bit. And what is particularly challenging...
you said that for the other bits were also the hardest bit.
Yeah, this is really the hardest part. And what's hard about this is that there's more than one type of detractor. And sometimes the detractors come from inside the system. And what I mean by that is there's one type of detractor that's very public and complains about it. And often it's local businesses, and often it's related to parking access. And it's a story you've seen 1,000 times. But their goal is to simply complain and have their things seen in public. That is half of their goal. They will tell you they want the project to be canceled, but very often just giving them the opportunity to air their frustration will help with that sort of detractor. But there's another type of detractor who knows or donates to the elected officials who have power to cancel your project. This is really hard, because sometimes those people have an in that you will not have unless you're a billionaire to be able to donate to political campaigns. It's also hard because very often the city staff will not tell you that elected officials are meddling. And so that's why it's super critical to involve those elected officials early and to have objective evidence at each stage of the process that their constituents support this, regardless of a well-pocketed investor constituent who wants to convince them that they need their parking space.
Yeah, because we often hear about, like money and politics and corruption and stuff, but it seems like ultimately a widespread community attitude would be stronger than any amount of funding. So like if you imagine someone says, I'll donate, $20 million to your campaign, but I want you to do something really, really terrible. Like I want you to remove every single school. I want you to like kill children. I want you to like cut down every tree. Like it just wouldn't happen. There would be no amount of money that you could pay or donate to a campaign that would get someone to do something hugely, hugely unpopular that would ruin their life. So in a way, like the community attitude, I think will ultimately overcome the donated money if it's strong enough and widespread enough.
Yeah. If it's strong enough, that's right. It needs to overcome that inertia, which is pretty large. Another way to think about it is that very often for a politician, even without this donor thing, any change to the city in their district, city as a whole, always has the potential to have bad things happen. And so you can view it from their perspective as the best chance to have not bad things happening is to have no projects. And that sounds extreme, but to be really honest, that is the behavior that we observe over and over again with elected officials, that it's easier to take no action than to take action. And so the art of working with the community is that we need to invert that. In other words, the cost of no action we need to make for them to be larger than the cost of taking action. And that's usually through forms of shame or advocacy. So to tell them, the community is looking for this, why aren't you acting? Calling them out, using letters to the editor or op-ed pieces to use that for public shaming. And that works because, if you get that pressure to be higher than the cost of doing nothing, they will take action. But it has to be real, it has to be rooted in the community, and you have to have that objective evidence of that starts at an earlier stage of the project. Because once you face that opposition, if you hadn't done that research, it's so much harder to do it in face of that opposition than if you had done it before it blows up to be something kind of out of your hands.
So you have a kind of a carrot and stick approach prepared to overcome the basic inertia that is common all in the world, not just in this process, that basically to do nothing means nothing will go wrong.
Yeah.
To do something at all means things could go wrong. And we've got to kind of like burst that inertia that to do nothing actually will lead to bad things. To do nothing is to get the stick. To do something is to get the carrot. And you have to kind of like manufacture that kind of new reality for them.
That's right. Now, the good news for us as Safe Streets advocate is that the data is objectively on our side, that the longer we have unsafe streets, the more people get injured or killed. Unfortunately, that argument in and of itself does not usually work with elected officials. But it's morally true. And I do think that the long arc of history is moving in that direction to make that realization. But at the local level, which is where this always happens, it's just hard. And you have to use every trick in the book to go forward.
Right. And then after this, let's say you are overcome this, we're getting to like our final measure of success is they cool, they all have a meeting once a month and they sign off, they approve the budget. And
yeah, so we'll use 17th as the example. I won't name names, but I'll say the city had approved it. Even the supervisor said, hey, great, this is cool. The city put it on their quick build list. They have it in the calendar. And then someone calls up someone and says, don't do this project. And so that is a multi-month process of increasing the pressure to get the advocates and community to push those elected officials forward to overcome the donor or the resistance internally. But even when that happens, even when you're able to overcome that, then the next step is often procedural and helping the staff at the agency move forward. And what I mean by that is that sometimes projects get lost and stuck in the bureaucracy and don't move forward for really dumb reasons. I'll give you an example. In reality, you have limited capacity as a city to do projects, and there's a queue of all the different things they need to work on. Someone ran into a light pole, they need to fix it. A stop sign needs to be replaced. These signs are going old. And so even if you get all the political approval, the funding sources, sometimes the project will fall apart because of the inability of the local agency to deliver. Unfortunately, this is reality in many cases, and whether we like it or not as an advocate, we do have to take that on. So to your point, a strategy is to have a regularly scheduled meeting with the political supporters and the agency staff. And you as the advocate are acting as a pseudo project manager. In some cases, the city will bristle at that and not be super receptive to it, but almost always, the individual employees of the city agencies will appreciate that effort. They really do need that help so that because they also depend on other agencies. So even if it's the SFMTA, there's the Department of Public Works or an outside contractor that may be actually doing that work. And sometimes they need help to push things so that it actually gets done and doesn't get lost forever in a queue. And as frustrating as that is, that's part of the necessary things, the boulders that we have to get out of the way to get these projects to move forward.
Right. So you should just plan out for like a monthly project check-in meeting, like just to basically be the squeaky wheel and maybe
Totally.
provide a little bit of project management support to make sure it doesn't accidentally go down one of these bureaucratic holes, and just to basically keep it, even though it's on the approved list, that it stays actually, it just doesn't get sort of forgotten about.
That's right. And kind of coming back to structure and support, that's where I really appreciated working with a neighborhood association so that they were handling some of the blocking and tackling of, here's our regular monthly meeting for the Livable Streets Committee, and here's the Zoom invite, so that then I can focus on the hard stuff to be done and work with that community organization to do some of the procedural or administrative stuff on a regular basis.
Cool. And overall, I mean, just to wrap it up, remember yesterday you said, do you think we can even talk about this for a whole hour?
That's right. Yeah, there's a lot here, huh?
Yeah. There's like a lot of things we haven't even talked about. But we should wrap it up so people can listen in a cohesive way.
Yes.
And when they get too long, you fall off.
So there's two more things that are really critical.
Oh, there's two more still? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So when it goes in the ground, you need to celebrate. And you need to celebrate as much as possible. And you need to recognize the city staff and the elected officials as the hero and pretend that you did not exist. And as frustrating as that may be, it's the right thing to do. And what that does is help cement the value of the project on paper. Ideally, you get articles, social media posts, so that when there's another class of detractors that will start to detract after the project's in the ground. So that's also what we have to start planning against when we celebrate our new street layout. Then there's another step, which is, in the best case, the city does this, but if they don't, you have to do it, to do surveys of road users after the fact. The reason why that's so important is that, in my experience, everyone, including motorists, appreciates mode separation. In other words, they actually do want bike lanes that are away from them. And when you ask them their thoughts about the project afterwards, when it's in the ground, most motorists like these projects because they don't feel scared that they're going to hurt a pedestrian or a cyclist as easily. And then you have the objective feedback from all the different users that say this is actually good. So that in the worst case, that a detractor is strong enough to get the attention of elected officials to try to have them reverse the project, and that does happen, that you have further evidence that is objective, showing that all road users appreciate this change and we shouldn't reverse that.
What, did they take it out?
Yes, it happens.
Oh my God. So you've just got all through the way these detractors that are basically going to try and stop you.
Yeah, I think Culver
Even after
City,
it's finished.
Culver City in Los Angeles is an example of this, where as the city council switched from one left-leaning to more right-leaning, part of their work was reversing some of those street improvements that the previous group had made. So it's a thing.
It's quite insane, the hatred that some people have for protected bike lanes, which I don't really understand, especially being a parent of a small child. You suddenly see how vulnerable children are to traffic. It's not just about you as a cyclist anymore. It's like, oh my God, my kid could die at any moment. Yeah. I got a lift home from we were volunteer installing solar panels. And the other guy who was on the roof, we spent the whole day volunteer installing solar panels. I don't have a car, so I asked him to give me a lift home. As we were driving home, we went around a corner and there was a new bike lane protected with bollards. And he was just like, what the fuck is this? Fucking just all these cyclists taking over. Look what they did to the street. Now there's all these dumb things sticking up. And I'm just like, dude, like he had this visceral, intense hatred of it. And I was like, in a context if we were doing like a green activity, So I was like, oh my God, I can't understand why someone would hate it, but people can. You can changes trigger extreme reactions from people, which seems to be just this huge theme through this conversation is mitigating and working with that. And you have to have a really cool bike lane party that gets press at the end.
Yeah.
What did you decorate it? Did you actually literally have a party with decorate? Did you put a big ribbon around it and confetti?
Peter and Donovan did a ribbon cutting ceremony. So, you get the ribbon out, you get the big scissors, you cut that up, and in the best case, you're involving city staff too, and it's a celebration thing with elected officials. This one was a little smaller, but it could be really fun. And then you also have a little party afterwards for all the folks that helped push that project forward. And another follow-up step is to have all of the constituents hit up the businesses and tell them that they really appreciate the new infrastructure and that they are biking or walking to their businesses. So continuing to reinforce, even with those detractors, even after the project's in the grounds, that they appreciate it. Gosh, it feels like a never-ending thing. It's like...
Yeah, wow. Like, I mean, you've done an incredible job mapping all this out. Can I just go over it? And I'm just going to, I've written down the steps.
Yeah.
And then tell me whether I've got it all right. Because like I said, it was called a power map. I want to do it as like a snakes and ladders map.
Yes, I like it.
Okay. Number one, make sure you've got a problem statement and you are talking to people at the same time as really fleshing that out in a serious way before you jump into the solution. Step one. Number two, identify the project area and whether it's private or public. Number three, you have to announce it and make a simple website or an email list or WhatsApp group to have people start signing up so you get that little bit of a community group there. Number four is you get your community input and you're still not talking about the solution. You're doing lots of listening, offering different alternatives that are maybe like very slightly different. Your foot in the door alternative, maybe like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I love the idea of doing a super out there one because then people would be like, no, let's just have the medium out there one, which is actually pretty out there. You know, you give some options and you're still sort of like listening and gathering support. Then you're looking at which of these, let's say it's 5 options that you provide is the most feasible. And you're figuring out then what is the agency, which is the agency who looks after it. Number 6, you're doing your power map, which is who are all the decision makers and the budgets of the mapping out that process. Then I've got 7, the feasible solution, the most feasible solution, and you're talking to everybody about it. So it's almost like another layer. You've got this multiple like iterative layers, like wave upon wave upon wave of community engagement and government engagement through this process. It's not just one wave. Almost like layers of paint that kind of build. Then number 8, you find out which is the preferred alternative. Number 9, you have to build a big enough coalition because you're going to get so much feedback. It really then becomes about numbers. You can't just be a little group of 5 people. You want to get lots of people in. So you need to do more public marketing. Number 10, you need to find the money, which you said is the hardest bit, but then you said the other few steps are also the hardest bit. So we're escalating into like hard bits. Then you've got to figure out which agency has the money. Then number 11, you need to get on the list, whatever your city's version of the list is. We will have to ask around and network to figure out how that works. Number 11 is the city will then do their own survey. So they'll repeat everything that you've done and they will do it themselves. And then you'll get to the stage where it'll get approved on the list and then they'll put it out publicly. So this public announcement, number 12, is where you're going to start moving towards your big boulder, the biggest of the boulder, the real actually hardest bit. And then you'll start to get the negative backlash, which will potentially make everybody skittish. And that's what you're really preparing for, is this the big phase. And then you've got to then use all of this kind of social capital you built from all your connections to keep carrot and sticking all of these government people to make sure that they don't just fall into inertia and they actually still approve it.
That's right.
Number 13 is you need to set up your squeaky wheel process, which is a regular meeting to make sure it just doesn't get lost. That you're just going to keep on, even if they hate it or they don't show up, you just put it on a calendar, like once a month meeting, we're going to Zoom. It's just a project check-in to make sure that you're the squeaky wheel to the end. 14 is you celebrate the outcome. You have your bike lane party. Just do whatever positive feedback. You want to put lots and lots of positive feedback for all of the people who helped, especially the people in the government. And then the final step, number 15, is you need to do an after survey to show that why do we have the after survey? Yeah. Partly to prevent it being gone backwards, but I think there's probably more reason than that than to just get it.
And it's also to document that, hey, we did this thing. What was the outcome, and what was the reaction from the community? And in theory, that's also useful for future projects that are similar. And I've actually used some of that data from Folsom Street, which was a city project to do a similar protected bike lane. That's where I saw the results of the feedback that just stunned me to see how 90% of motorists like the changes. And I think that's important to have recorded down as officially as possible because it's going to make future projects so much easier. And then in the worst case where you have detractors to try to reverse it, then you have evidence to say, actually, everyone really likes this. So why would we get rid of it?
Yeah. And so now you've been through this whole process a few different times. Are you excited to do more? What's the future in your traffic advocacy life And also the
Yeah.
future in terms of like you as a startup entrepreneur with your software, like
Yeah,
what's on the cards for the next 18 months with this stuff for you?
honestly, my hope is to continue the work we're doing to make this process so much easier for advocates and globally around the world. And part of that is to make it simpler to have the different ideas and to consider alternatives. And that's a lot of what I'm focusing on, is the blocking and tackling of what is possible, what is feasible, and how do you give the community members access to the same power as the elected officials for the engineer. And part of that is access to the tools. And so we're trying to make that as easy as possible. Part of what we do then is also engaging as consultants with some large multinationals, some small community groups, and everywhere in between to help them through this process. So part of what I do is actually consult with groups all over to go through this process together and to help them often with the materials, the collateral that they need to support those different things. My honest hope is that we can actually, over time, fix the system so that this is not a struggle for each and every project. And hopefully someday we can get to the point where we say, what is the project, not if there's a project. So I'm looking forward to continuing that kind of like meta work to help empower other change makers to make this happen in their own community.
Do you feel like overall, like the trend of where everything's going, do you feel like, I mean, when I was like a teenager, like bike paths didn't exist. Like this whole idea of a green, they weren't there, you know, and now I'm a grown up, they are there.
Exactly.
Like,
I think
do you
the
feel it's
trajectory
all moving, you know?
Yeah, I think if we're being honest with ourselves, it's pretty positive. You know, the fact that lay people, the community in general, is interested in these issues, I think is remarkable. Like, I really felt like an outsider 20 years ago, and now it feels like, I just saw a post on Reddit today about why people are pissed off about motorists doing right turn on red and they hitting pedestrians. Like, it's an issue that like the general public seems very aware of now. So that's, exciting. And I think the next step is, how do we do a better job of getting these projects to move forward without it being this big production, at least 14 steps each time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to sort of wrap it up with the sort of concluding thought that sort of fits into the wider scope of my podcast and work theme, which is people ask me, like, it's the one thing people ask me the most out of anything. It's like, why should we look at individual behavior when what we really need is systems change? And then I actually just wrote this like really big, long email tutorial about this topic, and I've recorded a 4-part podcast series on it because I get asked it so much. But like when you listen to this conversation and you realize that what's getting in the way is that there are these human beings that are going to complain and they're going to stop it over and over and over again. And the whole process of changing the system, which you are literally changing the bike and road system, is you are going to have to overcome this psychological, it's entirely psychological, this opposition.
It's an emotional reaction
that you are coming into.
That's right.
And so the kind of connection is, I think when people, let's say, environmentally or progressively optimized in their psychology, these things come together, sort of like a behavioral set is like one of the academics mentioned it before. The sort of green or progressive behaviors don't come by themselves. They come like as a set. Like if you're kind of like interested in more trees, you kind of usually also kind of into climate change, and you also kind of generally think that gay marriage is okay. And you generally think that fossil fuels and cars are bad. They're kind of like, and that maybe you shouldn't use plastic bags. So these kind of like thin edges of the wedges of these small green behaviors kind of lead to and spill over or enable bigger green behaviors and a bigger sort of like change in mindset. Like if you're like, okay, yeah, I'm going to like not use the plastic bag. And yeah, I'm going to like buy some organic food, and maybe I'll try and eat less McDonald's. You're starting to like shift your consciousness and your mindset in these behaviors. That inevitably sort of trickles through your consciousness and spreads through until you're the person that is pro the bike lane and not anti the bike lane. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like they're all kind of like connected. So you're optimizing the entire community, like environmental psychology and behaviors are optimizing the community mindset so you can enable systems changes to happen, that it is not at all just, let's just tell everybody to ride bikes and tell everybody to not use cars anymore. And if we just get everyone to change their behavior and do the top 10 green tips, then everything will just work. Like, I just think that this whole conversation just really extrapolates how the behaviors and the consciousness enables the system's change. And it's an essential part of it. Without it, you're like everybody will oppose you, not just a few people.
That's right. That's right.
But
That's totally true. I mean, and I see this too, and just reflecting on our conversation, how much of this comes down to individual relationships in that local area to make these projects happen. And so you can set a national policy for doing this stuff, but even if you say the money's available, it's still going to come down to what does the community say when they are proposed with these plans, and how do we shape that conversation so it results in the outcome that we're all looking for.
Yeah, and overall, looking back on your time doing this, if there was one like skill that you think you need, like an emotional skill, like a thing that you have to have inside you to be able to make it through this multi-year process, what do you think that thing is internally?
Yeah, it may sound odd, but I would say it's somewhat of emotional detachment, because I used to be really emotionally tied to the outcome of these projects. And I still am, like I'm not going to hide that. But I really encourage people to think about this as there's a lot of different efforts, and not all of them will work. And obviously we'd like to see them all work, but it's not always going to happen, and that's okay. And that we're looking in the long term of how do we do this on a repeatable basis. And so that's part of my advice, is to not fear failure for a specific project, because even if it doesn't work out, that's what's going to help you make the next one successful, or to come back and for another bite of that apple 2 years when the neighbors forgot about the parking battle. So it's totally possible to do. The change is happening, but sometimes you have to expect that it's going to take a long time, and you may lose a few battles, but you're going to win the war in the long term.
Okay, awesome. Well, this has been just such a fabulous conversation, and
Thanks,
thank you for
Katie.
sharing all of your knowledge. I'm going to write it all up and put it together. Where can people find out more about 3D Street? Can they sign up to a trial on 3D Street?
Yeah, there's a free version, 3dstreet.com. Check it out.
Mm-hmm. And if somebody is in a local community group, or they're part of a local city, maybe they can even hire you or
Totally.
get a paid membership to 3D Street to
Totally.
help make it happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Kieren. Good luck with everything. And I can't wait to see what's next for you and your business.
Thanks, Katie.